Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this legal webinar series run by Kaizen Synergy Law Firm. My name is Nihal Samara. I'm the General Counsel and Legal Director here at Kaizen Synergy Law Firm, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's session. Today's session focuses on the child safe standards, and we're going to look at an overview of the compliance obligations of what your agency needs to meet and give you a summary of what areas you should be focusing on. We'll also look at some case studies of what other agencies similar to yours has done in order to meet their governance, risk and compliance works as well too, and what it means for your agency. As always, we'd like to pay our respects to the elders past and present upon the lands on which we all meet. While this session is being run by webinar and recorded all the way up to the question and answer part of the session, we do pay our respects to the traditional owners accordingly. So first off, let's just have a look at some of the legal resources that your agency gets out of these webinar series that our law firm is running. Firstly, when we talk of child safe standards, it is something that agencies that provide services for children need to be aware of, and compliance obligations have recently changed. That being said, there is the need for agencies to be really across specific requirements for board members, staff as in employees, and also volunteers. There's also the need, as you will see in the standards, to be across different policy, code of conduct, and incident reporting policies. And this is something that agencies often struggle with, to know where the line in the sand is for these particular areas. So to show you what we have done and what agencies have actually worked really well in rolling this material out, I will actually walk you through the Southern Migrant Refugee Centre based in Dandenong in Victoria in terms of what they've done and also the resources that I'm talking about as well. So let me just jump you in and show you essentially what they have worked across and how it's actually worked for this agency. So essentially the resources that you'll get access to under the Child Safe training and obligations workshop that we're running at the moment through this webinar series is available through our website. And you can simply go to gemba360.com and you can log in to what I'll call the big blue circle that you can see in front of you. You will get access to this. We've got open it up for all agencies to have a single seat to access these resources. So what you'd see is the dashboard that looks similar to this in front of you. Click on the Gemba College button and it'll actually take you to this screen here. And you can see we've got the Child Safe training. And if you click on that button, the Child Safe training, it will actually open up into this screen here. And we've actually divided the training specifically focused on the all staff area, volunteers, if you've got those as well too, and most charities do, and also board members as well. So we've got the three training areas that your agency can actually access. Now, I will say in terms of the Southern Migrant and Refugee Centre, what they did actually, and very, very well, was actually open this whole dashboard up to their staff as well as their volunteers and board members as well. And essentially when staff, and I'll call it staff or personnel, completed this training by simply watching it, they were able to actually run this out and very quickly roll their child safe training out to a couple of hundred odd personnel within about a week. So that being said, people obviously work part-time and the likes, but essentially they open it up. People got a link in to access the Gemba dashboard, and they were able to access it as well. Also, what we did find was that when this training was rolled out, if people had questions, then they could simply click on the support desk chat group here, and this would actually link back to our law firm to answer any questions that they had as well. The most questions that only, look, there was a handful of questions that people had where they just wanted assistance in actually to reset their password in order to access the training. That was done. They jumped in, clicked on the Gemba College button. It took them to this screen here. They went to the training, and then they were able to actually monitor and roll this training out very, very quickly. So you can see that essentially on the dashboard, people can actually access this material, and it is available for you to access and view these resources. And that'll actually include even today's webinar for those that are attending. Now, on the side of the policy documents, as part of the resources, you can go into the Gemba Docs area as well too. And what you'll find is that in the policies and procedures register, we have a whole series of templates, and I will just bring these up for you as well too. One of which is this one here, which is the mandatory reporting requirements. And we've got a template that you can actually use, which covers off specific responsibilities, what the legislation is, and what the procedural framework really should actually look like. And this is based on the legal compliance areas that your agency needs to follow, along with the definitions of what your agency should also be across. The other one that we do have, which is, and I'll bring this up, is the Code of Conduct policy document. And the Code of Conduct is all about promoting cultural safety, as well as safety in children with a disability, for cultural safety for people of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander descent, and also children from linguistically diverse backgrounds as well. So the Code of Conduct essentially covers off the key areas that your agency needs to follow, as well as what we call the Statement of Commitment that you expect to follow as well too. So these are all templates that your agency can use. You can see that we've got the ability, and I'll just highlight this here, to say my agency, and you can simply do a search and replace across it for you as well too. And essentially these resources and tools are being made available, so you've got access to the training as well as the policy documents that you can access as well too. And these are all under the specific legal resources that I refer to. But I will add that the Southern Migrant and Refugee Centre opened these training sessions up to all staff, and very quickly they rolled this out to a couple of hundred odd people within the space of only a few days. And that actually gives you a real life case study of how quickly it was done. And that includes actually being able to run reports out of this to see who's actually watched the video as well. But this also included, I can see a couple of questions coming through, this also included board members and workers like volunteers that never actually went on site but accessed this remotely directly off their laptop or mobile device. So essentially the recommendations, for those of you that have joined us over the past few weeks, we always like to list our recommendations of what your agency should be following. Essentially we say, look, have a look at these legal resources, access your Gemba 360 dashboard, including the training, policy templates, risk register reports. And if you have any questions, by all means, reach out to us. So let's have a look at essentially the child safe standards, and we do acknowledge respect.org.au, where some of these slides have come from, and also the department down in Victoria of Community Services, specifically focused on the child safe standards. We will be looking broadly across the child safe standards, both at a national level and then actually dropping into a number of different states and territories within this presentation. So when we look at governance, risk and compliance, and this is a slide that we have used in our past presentations as well. Essentially, we look at, from our end as a law firm, look at the legislation, look at any ministerial orders, look at what the regulators are saying, as well as any policy directives. And then from there, our resources are built on providing you with either self-assessments or training modules, and also other policy documents. So essentially, this is the process that we follow. What is important for your agency to be across, though, is essentially there are a large number of regulators from a compliance point of view that are looking at you. Now, if you're a single service based in a single state, for example, in Queensland or New South Wales or Victoria for the likes, then when we talk of child safe standards, then there are specific requirements that you need to be across. And obviously this comes out of the relevant regulator charged with actually policing some of the child safe standards. But I will add there's actually sometimes an overlap in terms of what your agency needs to look at. So let's say there's a policy in child safety that you need to roll out. Well, in fact, there is the need under Fair Work to actually consult with staff or volunteers in terms of what your agency needs to meet. This can be rapidly confusing if your agency is actually spread across a multiple number of states and territories as well too. And how do you go about meeting the different standards in the different states or territories as well? It also means that from a charity's point of view as well, your board members have obligations to ensure that they meet their own obligations too. Now, what does this mean? Well, essentially, while child safety might be a requirement for board members under legislation to complete, well, if board members are meeting their due diligence and also meeting their directives as a director as part of their good governance, then there are actually ACNC requirements that they also need to meet as well too. So you can see that essentially when we start talking of child safety and reporting obligations, there are quite a few requirements that cut across different regulators that your agency actually does need to meet. And it's not simply listed under the child safe requirements. So essentially what we have set up, and I repeat this again, is that we look at, when we talk of these governance series, webinars that we are running, we'll look at the governance, risk and compliance that your agency needs to consider as part of the, I'll say, the line in the sand, and then essentially give you the resources around checklists and calendars and training resources that your agency can use straight after today's session. So in this presentation, what we are going to be looking at is the overview of the child safe standards, as well as what the possible consequences are for non-compliance. We're also going to look at, well, what is your agency's actual responsibilities and responsibilities as well too, keeping in mind that it's not different for board members or volunteers, but there are slightly different requirements that you need to inform your board members and volunteers about. Some of them obviously do overlap. So let's have an overview of the child safe standards and what requirements there are. So essentially, child safety includes matters related to the protection of children from child abuse, managing the risk of child abuse, and providing support to a child at the risk of child abuse, and responding, importantly, to suspicions, incidents, disclosures of allegations of child abuse as well too. Now, child abuse includes any act committed against a child involving sexual offense of grooming or a sexual offense, and also the infliction on a child of physical violence, including serious emotional or psychological harm as well too. So you can see that there is a specific requirements that agencies do need to be across in terms of what they need to follow as well. And that includes a serious neglect of the child as well. So the child safe standards, if you look at different states, they usually will follow this type of, I'll call it, process or history. We've just summarized one of these for you today. Essentially, there is the betrayal of trust inquiry. There was the Royal Commissions down in Victoria as well too. And then there was the original child safe standards that were originated in Victoria in terms of what actually happened here. But in saying that, the new child safe standards actually commenced on the 1st of July 2022. What we did find though after this was that essentially when you look at the child safe standards, the importance of this as well too is around understanding that child safe standards recognize that children are vulnerable and that there is the requirement for community service organizations to actually ensure that they prevent child abuse and build a culture of child safety. Now, what we mean by that essentially is that essentially, as a community service organization, you cannot assume that child abuse does not happen and cannot happen as well. And we can see this essentially in a number of other states and territories. And we will cover off what these actually are and what they actually mean for your specific agency and requirements as well too. So essentially what we do find is that child safety commonly is about promoting the safety of children, preventing the child abuse, ensuring effective processes are in place to respond to requirements of reported child abuse as well. And it's about embedding child safety in everyday thinking as well. Now, when we look at, and we'll start with the Commonwealth first, the Commonwealth Child Safe Framework was established in response to the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. And the framework aims to protect children and young people from the risk of harm and abuse. And this is focused on agencies that essentially do get Commonwealth funding and also provide services on behalf of the Commonwealth as well too. What is interesting here, when we look at the requirements, there are essentially 4 requirements that we can see. And each one of these requirements essentially is consistent with what other states and territories are talking about. And when we look at training, and this is something that I will focus on, the training and compliance aspects, and we have actually taken aspects of the specific child safe standards out from the Commonwealth, is essentially to have 4 specific areas. That is, have a clear and well communicated policies that meet specific requirements, provide training to staff about their obligations under the framework and any internal child safety policies, have in place staff screening processes to check the suitability of staff working with children, and have systems to monitor the compliance as well too. Now, if you look at those 4 areas, what you actually do find is that this is repeated across a number of other states and territories as well too. Now, I will just, while we run through Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland specifically, I will also add that Tasmania is in the process of establishing a legally mandated framework to uphold and improve the safety and well-being of children and young people in institutional settings. This essentially advances the recommendations of the Royal Commission. And essentially what we are seeing is the Child and Youth Safe Organisations framework is designed to actually provide safety to children in terms of what is actually being required. And I will just slide this in because this is under development at the moment in terms of what Tasmania government are currently looking at. And essentially you'll find that this same type of framework is actually repeated across other states and territories, and I will come to those in particular. So they do talk about what is a child and youth safe organization, what are the safe standards, what is the reportable conduct scheme, and what is the expectation for agencies in this space that do operate across this. And we will look at these requirements as we move across the policy context. So in Victoria, what we found was that on the 1st of July, the new child safe standards were introduced. And essentially this gave effect to the Ministerial Order 1359, which provides the framework for implementing the child safe standards in community service organisations. In, I'll call it neighbouring Queensland as well too, the foster and kinship carers share a responsibility alongside other partners in care to provide a level of care which is consistent with the Statement of Standards as outlined in Section 122 of the Child Protection Act. What we find is that under this, the Statement of Standards provides a measure of quality of care for children in care and forms a basis for assessing the requirements under the child safe standards. And what we also find in this is that there are essentially 11 standards. And you'll find that in the different states and territories, there are different, what I'll call number of standards across the different areas. For example, the Commonwealth has 4, Queensland has 11, which you have listed here. And what is important here is that for number 7, for managing child's behavior, must not actually include corporal punishment or punishment that humiliates, frightens, or threatens the child in any way. In terms of child safety, where the child will be encouraged to maintain family and other significant personal relationships in Queensland, where these requirements are incorporated in a child safe plan and placement agreement, it is important that these be put into context for what you need to look at. Now, in New South Wales, in contrast, there are 10 child safe standards, each one drawing on its findings, research, and consultation. And importantly, the child safe standards provide a benchmark against which organisations can essentially assess their child safety. And what you will find in your GEMBA dashboard is that depending on where your agency is based, will actually depend on what child safe standards appear in the self-assessment tool for you to look at. So the child safe standards are essentially here in New South Wales listed in terms of embedding organisational leadership and governance and culture. And you'll find this one similar to Queensland and also similar to Victoria as well too. It means then that they talk of equity, they talk of children are suitable, children are provided with suitable care and supported, right down to looking at policies and procedures and document how the organisation is actually child safe. Now, in Victoria, in contrast, there are 11 standards as well too. And those 11 standards are divided here. So you can actually see there is contrasts in terms of the different standards that apply in different states and territories, and in terms of what each agency does need to meet. And this actually goes back to when I was talking about the range of different reporting obligations that your agency does need to meet in terms of its reporting requirements. So when we talk of who is actually looking at you, it is actually important to consider that different regulatory agencies, when we talk of child safety, well, then there is the requirement that your agency may need to actually consider, obviously, ACNC in terms of ensuring that your board members are actually provided with relevant information. That Fair Work may also look at you and say, well, have you actually consulted with your volunteers or staff in terms of policy requirements as well? So there's a range of different, not just single focused regulators that may actually be involved in ensuring that you meet your obligations as well too, not just essentially looking at the child safety regulator as well. Now, when we jump into agency safety and policies as well, we look at a number of different areas that your agency should be considering and not just the standards themselves. So when we look at essentially the specific requirements of each of the standards and what your agency does need to consider, then all of a sudden you need to look at, well, what is our agency's policies, procedures, and staff responsibilities that you need to ensure you have in place. So essentially, we've looked at a number of areas that your agency needs to cover. And generally, you'll have policies for child safety at your agency that will cover one of these areas. But essentially, overarching in terms of your agency, you should be having documents that cover child safety and wellbeing policy, a code of conduct, as well as your child safety reporting procedure and policy as well too. And essentially, this allows you to manage the risks of child safety along with incident reporting as well. But when we come to this, one of the issues that agencies then face is, well, where is the line in the sand and what do we actually need to consider to have an appropriate policy? Well, if you remember right at the start, I said we have given you a series of policy templates, and you will see that we've got the mandatory reporting requirements here and what your agency does need to consider. And we also have, as part of this, the code of conduct as well. The incident reporting side, which I will just jump to as well too, can actually be found on your GEMBA dashboard. And if I go in to the Gemba dashboard to see what this essentially looks like. What you will find is that you do have the incident notification form. Let me just go here. You're under the risk management section. You'll find that you've got the incident form. And if you click on incident form, here we are here, you will find that you've then got the ability to add a new entry, and depending on which state you're actually choosing will open up the relevant child safety reporting requirements. So if I click Victoria, then it'll open up Victoria. If it'll open up ACT or Tassie, it'll open up depending on which state or territory that you're reporting on as well too. So that is certainly there for your agency to look at and actually use as a benchmark. So under the child safety wellbeing policy, just heading back, really what this is about is demonstrating your commitment to providing environments where children are safe and feel safe. And it tells the community about strategies and governance arrangements to keep children safe. It also means that you're trying to actually look at sharing the commitment to keeping children safe within your agency. Now, Natalie, thank you for your question. This is a great question. In terms of would this include contractors in terms of being engaged to perform work requirements? So Natalie's just asked, would this include contractors engaged to perform work for our organization? Generally, it does, Natalie, if those contractors may come into either contact with children or alternatively may have access to information about children as well too. So again, providing them with a policy and requirements in terms of what your agency is expecting to do, then absolutely that's the case that you will find that you may need to engage with those contractors directly and those contractor agencies. In terms of Charlie's just asked, how do I get access to the Gemba dashboard? Charlie, we will send you those login details for you to be able to access these resources as well too, if you haven't already got them as well too. And we'll be in touch today with you. So with it, anyone that doesn't have access to the dashboard, by all means, just reach out to us and we can follow that up for you as well too, but we will be in touch with you. So essentially, this this child safety and wellbeing policy, also under different standards, does need to be publicly available. So what does it say about the policy, say about our agency's commitment to child safety? Well, the idea is that you are a child safe organization which welcomes all children and young people and their families. What it does mean is about what is the process so that way you can ensure that children are safe as well too. With it, if I can see Alison, who's just asked a question, and let me just bring this up. Alison has just asked, I will have access to, have requested online. Yes, Alison, we will come back to you as well too. And also we'll just pick up Laurie's question, who just asked, we have no children within the association. Does this mean we don't need to have this policy? Laurie, it's a good question. If your agency doesn't provide services to children, or children don't access your services, then you may not need to have this policy, but simply be aware of what your governance obligations are. If children do access your services or interact with your agency, then it is actually important that you be across the relevant child safe standards for your agency. So essentially the idea of all of this is to establish cultural safe environments and respond to diverse needs. And your agency does need to ensure under the standards that you do need to provide cultural safety by recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders' culture and identity and safety, and also children that may need support under LGBTQI plus status or have a disability as well too. So the Child Safe Code of Conduct, which is slightly different to the policy, does cover staff, volunteers and contractors. So picking up actually Natalie's comment from earlier, which means that any other member of your agency community involved in child-connected work will also be required to essentially sign up to this code of conduct. And it is also important to ensure that these are publicly available. Now, there are certain acceptable and unacceptable behaviors, and you'll find this quite consistently right across all of the child safe standards. And essentially, under legislation and compliance documents, they do talk about what is acceptable and unacceptable. What we've simply done is copy and paste this material directly into the policy documents that I mentioned before. So essentially, when you look at things like the next step, if you've got your policy, then you've got your code of conduct, is around the child safety risk register. And this is actually important in terms of looking at, well, how do we actually report incidents and actually keep a report or register of what we've actually done within our agency as well too. And essentially, what we do have it looked at, then essentially there is the need to actually manage risks across it. Now, I'm just going to jump ahead and look at this and actually picking up Alison's question, who's just raised in terms of looking at the screenings for children in terms of their agency, where they said, look, we do, and I've just picked up Alison's question, we work with children across most states, but on an ad hoc basis. And am I correct in thinking that we should follow Victoria requirements or nationally or both? Well, essentially, Alison, what we do recommend for agencies is essentially to do this. You can, under the Gemba dashboard, and I'll just bring this up as a resource, in terms of your risk register, if I click on risk register, then what we've actually done here, and you can see this is slightly different, the risk register, and I'll just pause on here. So essentially, you can actually look at each of the standards. So if you work across a number of different states or territories, you can load this into the risk register and essentially have this listed across, let's say, Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland as a single entry in terms of how you actually report on this. So you can actually show what steps you're taking to meet those risks, and you've got it listed here. Separately to that, which I will add, is if I just go back to the dashboard, is in terms of incident reporting, which is slightly different. And this is the mandatory incident reporting where there might be an incident involving a child, and essentially you need to individually report this. And we've got agencies that work across different states and territories, and essentially they can actually rate their risks of issues that they've got and then complete this incident form. And this is something we will be looking at next week as part of the focusing on mandatory reporting incidents and also risk registers. But I will say that we will be covering this off as part of the next session. So the risk registers, what you can see here is around having the process in order to monitor and record incidents as well as record risks within your agency. The other part that we've included as part of the policy template is around complaints policy. And the complaints really is about relating to child abuse and how this will be managed within your agency, as well as how you actually report this as well too. The other part that you also need to carefully consider is around worker screening. And that is an important part that essentially you need to consider in terms of staff locations and also ensuring that you respond to incidents, disclosures, and suspicions of child abuse. And we will be building off this next week. Essentially, the process is quite straightforward. You need to respond to the emergency, report to authorities, contact parents or carers, and then provide support. In doing this, what you are doing is meeting your minimum, what I'll call legal compliance obligations, and ensuring that you're reporting on what issues you need to look at. The other part that you also need to consider is the signs of child abuse and what to look out for. Now, children and young persons can be harmed by other children or adults as well too. And it's also important that this doesn't have to include physical contact or force. And child abuse can include talking to a child in a sexually explicit way, grooming, experiencing family violence, and failing to provide a child with an adequate standard of nutrition, supervision, or medical care. So you can see that it is very, very broad. What you will also find is that there is the requirements for information sharing for staff with other agencies. And particularly, let's say in Natalie's case or Alison's case, who just asked the questions where they may work across different states or territories, then again, there is the document retention policy that you also need to consider in terms of ensuring that you report and keep information about minors. In some states, like Victoria, for example, and Queensland and New South Wales, there is actually criminal laws around not keeping appropriate documentations, which we will also cover off next week. Now, all records essentially for organizations must follow record policies, and it is something that you need to consider as part of your reporting obligations. When we talk of empowering families and children, then it's important that you look at their views and raise concerns, and this is inclusive across all the different national child safety standards in different states or territories. The key things to remember is that child safety and well-being at your agency is everyone's responsibility. And essentially, it is important that you implement policies to cover these requirements off. I'm more than happy to stay online and answer any questions that you might have. If you are watching this recording after today's live session, then by all means, please reach out to us on the numbers listed here on 1300 360 360 or email us at support@gemba360.com.